This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee Bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. My name's Winifred Lewis, and I'm a professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea. I am a research assistant in UQ.
And I'm Montana. I'm a psychology student at UQ.
Yeah, and we're here today to talk about the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements, and in particular, Chapter 1, Environmental Movements Worldwide. And that is authored by the editors of the handbook, Marco Giugni and Maria Grasso. So these folks are both political scientists, and Marco is a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Geneva. And Maria Grasso is a professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. They're both scholars in social movement studies, as you can tell by them choosing to put together this book. I guess one question that I didn't realize needed answering, but when you read the chapter, of course, the first thing that happens is, what is a social movement? And the environmental social movement is defined in the chapter. And I think you've got the definition there, right, Montana?
Yes, I do. An environmental movement may be defined as a loose, non-institutionalized network of informal interactions that may include, as well as individuals and groups who have no organizational affiliation, organizations of varying degrees of formality that are engaged in collective action motivated by shared identity or concerned about environmental issues.
Right, and that's like a bit of a mouthful, 3 lines long. Yeah. But I guess it's good to be on the same page, and coming from a variety of different disciplines. So we mentioned we're psychologists and they're political scientists, but the book also includes sociologists and people from other areas like historians and economists. It is important to start off with that definition. The structure of the book is that there's 6 parts, and the broad themes that the editors want to draw out are that social movements need to be understood as incredibly diverse and also as transforming and institutionalizing. So that last term is not as familiar to psychologists, I think, as to the political scientists, but basically it refers to the fact that as the environmental movement has become more and more successful, it's being reflected in organizations that are coming into government. So departments of the environment are being created, and bodies like the United Nations have environmental branches, and groups like the industry bodies might have environmental concerns. So that's what they mean by institutionalization. And transformation is really about how movements are changing from becoming, for example, like small and grassroots to large multinational active groups, as well as perhaps changing in their content focus, increasingly looking at things like climate change. So those are kind of big themes that the editors bring up in the set. And then they start talking about each of the parts of the book, right? So the first one, I think, is geographic regions. Is that right, Montana?
Yeah, so part 1 talked about environmental movements around the world, and it sort of touched briefly on movements in North America, Latin America, Western and Eastern Europe, all around Asia and Africa, and in Oceania.
Yeah, that's right. And that was how we got roped in, for those that are curious. Myself and a couple of other people from UQ, we wrote the chapter on Oceania. And then what's the second part of the book about, Andrea?
So the second part of the book mainly focused on key issues and movement sectors in environmental movements. So as we mentioned before, environmental movements are highly diverse collective actor, and they are formed by different actors and organizations, and often they apply very different tactics and strategies. So in part 2, we kind of touches on a wide range of issues, including natural protection, conservation to nuclear energy, climate change, animal rights, and environmental justice.
Yeah, and a couple of those terms aren't quite as familiar, right? Like, so what is environmental justice?
Environmental justice is when low-income family and poor people might be more at cost facing the pollution and also environmental issues.
That's right. And in addition to like environmental justice issues around wealth, there's also like straight out racism and kind of the history of colonialism. So environmental justice issues also occur when people are more ready to tolerate like pollution and the impact of climate change on people that aren't like from a Western background, or that aren't in the global North and the European and North American context. So that's an important theme. And the other one you mentioned was animal rights. And what I saw in that first part is they were careful to distinguish sort of traditional understandings of animal rights, like preventing cruelty, from another chapter, which is on food activism. What is food activism?
Food activism is a rather new term. We want to know the source of our food, the way it is manufactured, and safe for us to put it on the table.
Yeah, and also that the animals are treated humanely. So a lot of protest against like industrial farming, like battery hens or the mistreatment of pigs, that can occur under this heading. So if you choose not to eat certain animals, like if you only eat free range eggs, that kind of comes under that term food activism, which is, I myself hadn't heard it before reading the introductory chapter either. And then part 3 is something I was going to talk about. It is macrostructural conditions and processes. So again, for psychologists, this language is a bit unfamiliar, but it refers to how societal and governmental forces affect environmental movements. And obviously there's a whole range of factors, and there's 6 chapters in this section. So some of them deal with issues of how the groups are connected to each other, like the organizational networks, how Greenpeace might link in with the United Nations or with the World Wildlife Federation. And others deal with mobilizing in experts and expertise, how the scientific community has contributed to environmental movements, both by being activists, but also by, inspiring people to take up action. And then there's chapters on the political context and how themes of, being democratic or authoritarian can affect environmental movements, and themes around the different ways that environmental movements change. So they pull out 3 chapters on 3 processes. One's radicalization, which is addressed in the context of the environmental animal rights movement. So the idea that people might be more willing to consider strategies such as property destruction or sometimes violence. And another one is commercialization. So this is how environmental movements have actually become, economic factors where people might choose to buy green products, and companies might try to market themselves based on their environmental credentials. And then there's the concept of institutionalization, which really refers to how environmental movements are successfully breaking into government and becoming institutions. So, for example, most governments around the world now have environmental ministries or departments of the environment to consider these issues and to protect the environment. And big organizations like the UN have formed bodies and continue to form bodies that are dedicated to environmental themes. So those are all different chapters within this section, which is like super interesting. The next one, I guess, is on microstructural and social political dimensions. And that's something you're going to talk about, right, Andrea?
Yes. So on part 4, we are focusing on microstructure and social psychology dynamic of the environmental movements, which means that people's ties to certain social network and social group will support them and increase their willingness to support and participate in environmental movements. And part 4 also emphasized that social network serves as a recruitment process that will enable people to be more willing to become a member of the environmental movement.
Right, and it deals with some of the groups that might affect you too, right? Like, I think there's chapters on gender and environmental movements, and class and environmental movements, where class here refers to your wealth and working professional environment that you might be in. And I guess there's also some questions about framing and political values and socialization. tell us a little bit about that, Andrea.
So framing regards to whether we want to include this issue as environmental movements or we want to exclude that.
Yeah, how I would put it as well is like it talks about the problems and the solutions. So, you know, things about whether the environmental movement is focusing on pollution or focusing on global warming or climate change. Those are all changes of frame. And of course, the definition of the problem always affects the solutions that you're considering at any point in time. So I think of that as being really related to framing as well. And then when I think about political values and socialization, that chapter is in my mind going to be about how family background and the kind of cultural context that you're in, the cultural, political, religious context that you're in affect your values and how you relate to the environment. And then tell us about part 5, Montana.
So part 5 is about the consequences and outcomes of environmental movements. And it's only in the last several decades that these outcomes have been investigated. So this research, they mentioned in this part that this research is usually divided into 3 main sections, which is political, biographical, and cultural. And there are a number of chapters that focus on different sort of aspects of the consequences. Like, for example, the outcomes of movements and activism, policy and legislative outcomes, the relationship between environmental movements and cultural outcomes, and biographical consequences. And I think that's all of them.
Yeah, I have lost track as well. By biographical consequences, that's about what the impact is of being an activist for you personally. That's what I think we're going to hear about there.
Like,
yeah,
as an individual.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to all those chapters.
Yeah.
And then this last section is called Environmental Movements in the 21st Century. So that's part 6 of the book. And in that, there's chapters on the youth movements like Fridays for Future and the school strikes. And there's chapters on environmentalism and digital media, you know, the enormous impact of mobilizing with the new tools and the new social media platforms. And then there's a chapter on green democracy, which is about how green parties, for example, are taking up environmental causes and what that looks like around the world. What does green democracy mean in different contexts? And then there's a chapter on neoliberalism and social environmental movements, which I think for many people might need some unpacking. I guess like what I understand that term to mean, and it's something that I learned a lot about when I read the chapter, is neoliberalism is the economic and political movement to turn everything into commodities. So when we relate to nature, we could see forests or we could see logs waiting to happen. When we look at beaches, we can see beauty or we can see resorts waiting to happen. And so part of what neoliberalism has done over the last 30, 40 years is encouraged societies or pushed people to feel entitled and to feel like it's appropriate and a good thing to do to turn nature into commodities. And so part of the reason why people are so comfortable destroying the environment is that there's been a kind of value system where the worth of something is described in economic terms. So, if we change a beach into a resort, that's meant to be an improvement because there's jobs and there's tourist money that's flowing from that. So this was a very powerful and interesting chapter as well in this last section on how our political forces are affecting the environment and how environmental movements are coming to grips with that, which is generally by trying to articulate a principled opposition to neoliberalism and an alternate way for us to understand our path towards economic growth or degrowth, to limit our growth so that we're less likely to destroy our planet. And then the last chapter, of course, is on the future of environmental movements, where it all gets pulled together in one exciting theme. So that's our sort of potted summary of the book, which is the potted summary of chapter 1. I guess when I read it, I felt like I was excited to read the handbook, and I also felt like there was a lot in there that I didn't understand. I was looking forward to learning more about. What about you guys? How did you react?
I just feel like there are so many like exciting movements that's like happening around the world, and the environmental movement is not just Western focused. There
Yeah,
are many exciting things happen all over the world. And knowing this information, it also make me think that there are different tactics and strategies we can take, and there are different organizations and people we can collaborate with, and also we can set different goals and expect for different outcomes according to the different areas we live in. So yeah.
yeah, that's deep, Andrea. Well said. Montana, over to you. You've got the last word.
For me, it brought about a lot of questions because it talked about a lot of things that I don't have much knowledge on yet.
Yeah.
And like how we can actually create movements that will create change. Like, are we actually creating change, or and like sort of made me think about also how maybe the government likes to present itself. Like you see in New Zealand, they're like a typically green country. They're like, oh, we're really green and clean, and they have like they use 85% renewable energy. Whereas in Australia, we don't really have that image. So you see different outcomes. So I think it brought about a lot of I have a lot of curiosity about my own country now and what we're doing in environmental movements, I guess.
Yeah, so great. What a wonderful way to finish our discussion of chapter 1. 37 more chapters to go.
Yeah.
Thank you both, Montana and Andrea, and thank you to the viewers for being here with us today. Bye now.
Hi.